I grew up in a small house on the edge of a quiet American town, far away from busy highways or crowded neighborhoods, and the place where my childhood memories live is still clear in my mind. It was the early 1990s, a time when children could spend long afternoons outside, exploring backyards and empty fields before running inside at night when the air grew colder. The house where my family lived was old, with wooden floors that creaked under every step, walls that carried the faint smell of dust and age, and windows that looked out toward a row of trees that stood like guards between our yard and the deeper woods beyond. I was only around 9 years old, still young enough to be afraid of the dark, but old enough to remember clearly when something felt wrong. My bedroom was small, with a single bed pushed against the wall and one tall window that faced the backyard. At night, I often stared out that window before falling asleep, watching the way the moonlight painted shadows on the grass. Sometimes, if the wind was strong, the branches from the trees outside would scrape lightly against the glass, and I told myself it was nothing more than nature whispering to the house. I always tried to convince myself that nothing dangerous lived in the shadows outside. But even at that young age, there was a quiet sense of unease, as if the darkness carried eyes that I could not see. The memory I am about to share has followed me my entire life, and no matter how many years have passed, I can still feel the chill in my chest whenever I think about it. It was during one autumn night, a school week evening when the air was sharp and cool. My parents had gone to bed early, and the house was completely silent except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, when I had the strange thought that I was being watched. It was not a sound that woke me, not a movement inside the room, but a heavy pressure that built slowly until I could not ignore it anymore. I turned my head toward the window, expecting only to see the usual shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. At first, that was all I saw: the outline of branches, the dim silver glow of moonlight, the grass moving slightly as if breathing. But then my eyes adjusted to the shadows, and I realized there was something different, something that did not belong. Standing outside the window, almost pressed against the glass, was a tall, dark figure. It was not shaped like a tree, not shaped like a neighbor, not shaped like anything I could understand at that time. Its head was tilted slightly, as if studying me, and though the night was dark, I knew with certainty that it was looking directly into my room. For several long moments, I could not move. My small body froze under the weight of fear, and my mind tried to explain away what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a shadow cast by the branches. Maybe I was still half asleep and dreaming. But the longer I looked, the more real it became. The figure did not shift like shadows do. It did not fade when I blinked. It stood completely still, as though it had been there for hours, waiting silently for me to notice. Its shape was human but stretched, too tall for a normal person. Its arms hanging slightly longer than they should have, and there was no detail to its face. Only a dark emptiness where features should have been. I pulled the blanket over my head and held my breath, listening so carefully that I could hear the pounding of my own heart. Time stretched unbearably, every second heavy like a stone. I thought that if I stayed hidden long enough, the figure would leave, but a strange curiosity gnawed at me. Slowly, trembling, I pulled the blanket down just enough to peek out again. The figure was still there, closer than before, as if it had leaned toward the glass, its faceless head nearly touching the window. The next part of the memory is strange and difficult to describe. Even though the glass separated us, I felt an overwhelming sense of intrusion, as if it had already stepped into my room without moving. My skin prickled, my breath felt shallow, and I knew that whatever was outside did not belong to the world I knew. I wanted to scream for my parents, but fear locked my throat tight, and the only sound inside me was the silent scream that never came out. I do not remember falling asleep, but somehow the night passed, and when the weak morning light filled the room, the window was empty again. There were no footprints outside, no marks on the glass, nothing that proved the figure had been real. My parents brushed off my trembling words as a nightmare, telling me it was just my imagination. But I knew deep inside that what I had seen was real as the cold sweat that soaked my pillow and the heavy dread that followed me into daylight. That was not the only time I saw it. For several nights afterward, the same pressure would wake me, and when I dared to look, the figure was always there, sometimes farther away near the trees, sometimes standing motionless at the edge of the yard, and sometimes pressed directly against my window. Its visits were silent, patient, and unexplainable, and each time I saw it, I felt less safe in my own room. It never tried to open the window, never moved in a violent way, but its stillness was more terrifying than any sudden threat could have been. It was like being studied by something that did not understand humanity, something that belonged to the shadows, but wanted to be closer. Years later, when I became an adult and moved far away, I tried to bury the memory deep in the past, telling myself it was nothing more than childhood fear. But every once in a while, late at night, if I wake to that same heavy feeling of being watched, I cannot stop myself from checking the window. And though the glass has changed, and the trees are different, and decades have passed, a part of me still expects to see that tall, faceless figure waiting in the dark, watching silently, patient as ever. I was 8 years old the winter I learned that a house can keep secrets even when the family who lives inside it thinks they know every corner, every creak, every smell it holds. Our house sat at the end of a gravel lane where the trees gathered close enough to hold the sky like a dark sheet, and it was the kind of place where snow could fall for days and the world outside would become a soft, muffled blank, making the rooms inside feel smaller and more precious, like things you protect. My father worked long hours at the factory 2 towns over, coming home late with his coat smelling of oil and cold, and my mother kept the house warm and ordered, moving through each day with a gentle efficiency that made the house feel safe even when the weather was fierce. The house had been in my family for as long as I could remember, with a low, sloping roof, windows that rubbed against the frames when the wind pressured them, and an old metal cellar door at the back of the kitchen that led down into the earth where we kept jars of preserves, sacks of potatoes, and the winter coal that would keep the furnace fed through the cold months. The cellar had always been a place of small, grown-up mysteries for me as a child, a place adults went to for practical things and returned with their hands full and their breath smelling faintly of earth and winter cold, and I knew the rules without anyone telling me. Children did not go to the cellar alone after dark. Children did not open the heavy metal door unless a parent said so, and the light in the basement stayed off except when someone needed something and would not stay longer than necessary. Those rules mattered to me because in a house where the floors creaked like someone walking in their sleep, and the attic stored things that made your imagination run, rules offered pattern to follow, and patterns felt like safety. Even so, the promise of not being allowed into certain places carried its own pull, and like a magnet, I found myself drawn toward the locked-away world, wanting to know what was down there in the earth under my feet. The night everything changed was not a stormy night or a night of great drama. It was the kind of deep, cold Sunday when the light happens early and the day feels smaller than your plans, where my parents sat upstairs reading or watching a low-voiced show, and I was left with the stretching, slow hours of my own company. The snow outside had been falling all day, covering the lane and the trees in a bright, muffled sheet, and the whole world smelled of cold and wet wood. I remember the way the kitchen felt that evening, with its yellowed linoleum and the round table where my mother had set out a plate of cookies and a cup that steamed for a little while before growing still. The house was quiet in a way that makes every small noise large, and the metal cellar door sat at the back of the room like a small, dark eye into the belly of the house. I do not remember what thought first told me to go down there, only a small, insistent tug that grew louder the longer I sat at the table, stirring a cup I did not drink from. It felt like the kind of idea that visits a child when there is nothing else to break the silence, a notion that the forbidden can be known without harm if approached carefully and with patience. I told myself I would only go for a moment, only to peek and return, and the simplicity of that plan is still easy to regret, because sometimes the smallest choices carry the heaviest consequences. I stood up, feeling the cold come up through the soles of my feet, and walked to the back of the kitchen where the metal door sat flush with the floor, the painted handle smooth from years of hands, and I remember the small click and the breath I held as my fingers closed around the handle, pulling the door up and releasing the dark breath that rose from below, like the house exhaling. The first step down was the one that always seemed to carry the most weight, and as my booted foot landed on the top wooden step, I could feel the house change around me, as if the cellar belonged to a different world, where smells gathered, where the light did not know how to travel, and where the walls held a cold that settled into your bones and took time to leave. Normally, when an adult went down here, the single bare bulb would flare into life and blow away the dark in one clean, practical motion. But when I paused on that top step, that night the bulb remained stubbornly dark, and the cellar remained a soft black pool below me, and the old house seemed to hold its breath. I told myself again that I would only look, that the rules were a suggestion if the heart felt brave, and then I started down the steps, one careful foot after another, the wood beneath my feet worn smooth by years of use, and the smell of root vegetables and old paper rising to meet me. Halfway down the stairs, my eyes began to adjust, and what I first thought was only a trick of vision became something that uncoiled like a slow, patient animal. There was a light in the cellar, not the quick, harsh flash of the bulb, but a light that sat low and steady, a yellow that seemed to belong to something older than electricity, as if someone had placed a lantern down there and forgotten to take it with them. The light was not where the bulb should have been. It was closer to the back of the cellar near the row of shelves, where the jars slept in neat rows, where the sacks lay in soft piles, and where the old brass trunk that belonged once to my grandmother sat with its lid sealed shut by a fragile lock. The light made odd, small pools on the concrete floor and painted the jars with soft halos, and though its source was hidden by shadows, it felt like a presence rather than a thing, like a quiet attention that had settled into the cellar and decided to make a home there. I had the strange, childish belief at that moment that if I stepped down fully and put my hand on the light, it would be warm and friendly, and in that wish I felt both the bravery and the foolishness of being a child. I touched the light with my eyes first, letting them drink in its small radiance, and the colors it gave to the jars and sacks made everything look older and more important than it had in the pale kitchen light. The air smelled of cold and earth and the dry, faint sweetness of preserved peaches, but the smell carried underneath it something else I could not name, a metallic little tang that made the back of my throat tighten when I swallowed. I took another step down until the top of my head cleared the stairwell, and there it was, the light sitting still and watching like a slow animal. My skin prickled and my mouth went dry. Everything a child thinks will be simple often is wrapped around some secret complication, and I thought I would find a lantern on a barrel or a candle pushed into a jar. Instead, the light seemed to float an inch above the concrete floor, flickering almost imperceptibly, though there was no flame to be seen, and when I leaned forward it looked as if the light knew how to keep its secrets. I reached out with a single, small hand, the way a child reaches for a moth hoping not to frighten it. And when my fingers moved into that golden space, the air grew colder around my wrist, as if the light pulled some of the warmth from me to feed itself. And I felt a small, electric shock run up my arm, not painful but full of a sharp attention that made me pull back faster than I had expected. The shock left a small, bright ache in my palm and a longer unease that settled like dust, and I could not have explained then why I waited instead of running. Part of me wanted the comfort of returning to the kitchen with a triumphant tale, the satisfying closure of the forbidden explored and then safely reported, and another part of me felt something like pity for the light, like it was lonely and had learned to glow in a lonely place. The only sound was the house settling in my own breath, and in that silence the cellar seemed to grow a personality, a slow and deliberate patience that made the moments stretch as if they were being pulled through syrup. I took one more careful step forward to look for the source, and my foot brushed against something on the floor that was not concrete. It was soft and cold, and then my toes found a crumble of paper and old cloth and the edge of a broken wooden frame. In the dim, golden light I could see the hint of writing on a wet, faded piece of paper pressed into the crack of the wall, and though I could not read it from where I stood, the presence of words made the cellar feel older in a way that filled my chest with a small, strange sorrow. The light shivered then, not in the way a flame shakes when the air moves, but in a slow, deliberate way like a thought deciding to shift, and I felt watched though I had not seen eyes, only the feeling of being measured by a patient wait. The thing about being a child alone in a place that adults call ordinary is that your imagination will build company quickly, and my mind started to stitch a story around what I had found. Perhaps someone used to live here who liked small, steady lights. Perhaps the trunk in the corner had once held letters from a soldier and the light guarded them. Perhaps the light had a name and a sorrow and wanted nothing more than a witness. I cannot say whether my mind spun these to comfort me or to entice me further into danger, but I moved closer to the back wall where the light seemed to claim its territory, and the air grew denser, as if the cellar had gathered winter inside itself. Then, with a slow, terrible certainty, the light shifted position as if it had decided I was the better place to be, and not the dark. It hovered just above a rectangular shape on the floor that I had not seen before because of the way the jars and sacks lined the way like a border. When the light moved, it threw more of the cellar into relief and revealed that the rectangular shape was the outline of an old trapdoor, the kind that hides a deeper crawl space beneath the cellar, a place where farmers keep things they want truly out of reach. My breath hitched because I knew, with a child's simple knowledge, that every extra door in a house multiplied the possibilities of what might be hidden, and I remembered in the same instant a story my grandmother had once told me about the house having been built in parts, with old cellars above older cellars, layers lying like small secrets stacked one upon the other. The trapdoor had a handle that looked as old as the house itself, and when the light brushed the metal, the handle gleamed like a small, private star. Curiosity had always been my stronger companion than fear, and I crouched down to set my hand on the handle, the cold of the metal biting my palm, and left my fingerprint there like a child's signature. I told myself I would not open it, that simply touching the door would be enough to say I had been brave, but the door moved under my fingers with a sound like a slow sigh and a dry, ancient hinge complaining, and when it lifted a cold breath came up from below that smelled like money and dust and something that had been kept in the dark for a long time. I looked down into the hole, and in the pool of golden light I could see the first step leading into even more dark, and beyond that step under the light there was something that looked like cloth folded carefully, and something that might have been a child's toy, small and faded by time. For a curious child, The sight of a toy in a place adults had told you not to go was a kind of siren, impossibly compelling, and I could feel my fingers wanting to slip down the handle to lower myself into the hollow. I knew then that I was leaving the edge of safety and stepping onto a path that adults would have frowned at, but my small mind argued that if there was a toy down there, perhaps the house had been kinder to a child once, and I could be part of that past by simply taking one careful step. The first foot down the old trapdoor stairs felt colder than any step I took that night, and as I moved deeper the proper cellar, above the deeper one grew smaller until its light felt like a distant sun, and the deeper darkness pressed in until the golden light seemed to glow brighter in isolation. The air grew narrower, the smell stronger, and the sense of being buried under the house settled into my chest like a stone. I kept thinking that I would only reach for the toy and come back up, and this promise was a poor shield against the way the place made you want to stay, because each level down seemed more certain and more patient than the one above, and patience is the longest kind of danger as it waits you out. When my hand closed around the faded cloth of the toy, it was not a doll or a truck, but a small, soft bear whose stitched eyes had been worn away by time until only two darker hollows marked where they had been, and the bear smelled faintly of lavender and something old, and the touch of it made my chest ache with a sudden, huge tenderness that surprised me because I had not known how much I could want such a small thing. I held it close for just a second, feeling the weight of history in its seams, and then the light in the trap space changed, as if someone else had decided to breathe upon it, and the golden pool widened into the shape of a human attention turned toward me. It is hard to describe the exact edge where curiosity becomes alarm without dialogue or sound, but a child's body knows when the balance tips, and my limbs told me it was time to go before my mind had fully understood the danger. I put the bear into my coat and began to climb back, feeling every step like a theft from the house's deep sleep, and when I reached the topmost stair and pulled the trapdoor closed over my head, the metallic sound of it made the whole kitchen feel like waking. I do not remember a cry or a shout then, only the slow, heavy footsteps that came from the house above like an answer to the small theft, and when I pushed the cellar door up with shaking hands, the room seemed to hold a new shape. My mother stood by the kitchen table as if called there by a feeling she could not name, and when she saw me she did not ask how I had come to be below, only looked at the coat shaping with an awkward lump, and then at the small bear in my fist, and for the first time in my life I saw that adults sometimes hold their breath like children do, as if preparing for a revelation they do not want but know is coming. What followed then was a slow unweaving of ordinary explanations, and an arrival at something that sat outside the neat compartments of what we call real. My mother said little, only that we must never go into places that are closed to children after dark, but her eyes traced the cellar door, the place where my fingers had touched metal, and the way she moved was more a careful retreat than an angered scooping up of a child who had misbehaved. She put the bear on the table, and it looked smaller in the brighter kitchen light, its stitches gaping like small wounds. Her hands trembled then, and I saw she had seen something before, and that her life had kept secrets too, and when she touched the bear, the pattern on its seamed fabric reminded her of something I could not name. Later, when sleep had finally taken me, and the house lay with the regular breathing of people who had been awake and then tired, my mother sat at the kitchen table with the bear in front of her and stared at it for a long time, and the house breathed on. She did not tell me about the time the house had been repaired and they had found something under the first cellar level. She did not tell me that the older families who once lived in that place had left things there in a hurry, and that sometimes the things left behind seemed to want a witness. What she did instead was put the bear into a box of things she decided to send away in the morning, and told me, with the quiet certainty only adults can muster, that we were not to go near the cellar again after dark. The house kept the rest of its secret. In the years that followed, the memory of that cold stare and the warm bear made a shape I could touch in my mind when nights were long and the world outside felt empty. And sometimes I would wake with my hand curled into nothing and the sense of hands that were not mine pressing gently against the fabric of the house. As an adult, I know now that not all strange things in an old home are sinister in the way horror stories make them, and I know that the mind of a child creates stories to match the small, raw feelings it cannot understand. But the memory sits like a stone in my chest sometimes, heavy and certain. There are places under the houses we inherit that keep their own lives, and the light waiting in such a place is not always a call to the brave, but sometimes only a quiet, mournful thing that wants to be remembered. When I think back to my childhood, I remember many ordinary moments: school mornings, family dinners, the small rituals of bedtime. But the memory that has never loosened its grip on me is tied to the stretch of woods that lay behind our house. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest during the late 1980s, in a neighborhood where every house had its own yard, and most yards bled into patches of wild land that seemed endless to a child's eyes. Our house sat at the very end of the street, and instead of another row of homes behind it, there was a thick wall of trees, stretching far into the distance. The woods became the boundary of my world, both a place of fascination and of quiet fear, because every child learns early that places with no clear end carry secrets. I was 10 years old the first time I truly noticed something unusual about those woods, old enough to ride my bike without my parents watching from a window, but young enough to still believe that monsters might be hiding in the shadows if I looked too long. During the daytime, the woods looked almost welcoming, full of sunbeams that trickled through the leaves, filled with the sound of birds and the occasional scampering of a squirrel. My friends and I would sometimes wander in just far enough to feel bold, breaking sticks on fallen logs, daring each other to go deeper, before retreating to the safety of open yards where houses stood guard. But at night, when the sun was gone and the air was colder, the woods transformed into a wall of blackness that pressed against the edge of our backyard like a silent, watching ocean. My bedroom window faced those woods. Every night, before I fell asleep, I found myself staring into the tree line. The darkness there was never complete. Sometimes the moon would push faint silver light through the branches. Other times the faint glow of a distant neighbor's porch light would cast weak illumination. But no matter what light touched those trees, there was always a heaviness to them at night, as if the woods themselves exhaled something thick that covered their secrets. I did not know it then, but those long nights of watching would eventually give me a memory that shaped the way I felt about forests forever. It was early fall when the first strange thing happened. The air was cool. The leaves had begun their slow turn from green to gold, and the sky carried that crisp, restless feeling that only comes with the change of seasons. I had gone to bed at my usual time, listening to the muffled sounds of the television downstairs, when something caught my eye through the window. At first I thought it was just the sway of a branch in the wind, but as I focused, I realized it was a faint light deep in the woods, far beyond the line where I normally let my imagination stop. It was not the steady beam of a flashlight, nor the flicker of fireflies, but a soft, glowing presence that seemed to move slowly between the trees, almost as if it were alive. My small body froze under the blanket. I told myself that maybe a neighbor was camping, or maybe someone was walking with a lantern, but the glow felt wrong. It was too pale, too quiet, too deliberate. I tried to convince myself to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the light moving closer. I peeked out again and again, and each time it seemed as though the glow had shifted, inching nearer to the edge of our yard. Finally, I pressed my face against the cold glass and held my breath, staring with all the focus my young eyes could give. That was when I saw it clearly. Not a lantern, not a firefly, but something shaped like a figure, tall and faint, with a body made entirely of dim, white light. I remember the way my chest tightened, the way my mouth went dry. The figure did not move the way people move. It drifted, as if pulled forward by an unseen current, its shape bending slightly, but never breaking apart. It stood for a long time, just at the edge of the tree line, facing our house. Though it had no clear face, no eyes that I could see, I knew with absolute certainty that it was watching me. That knowledge settled into my young bones like ice water. I ducked beneath the blanket, heart pounding so hard that I felt it shake my ribs, and I stayed there until exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. In the morning, I tried to tell myself it had been a dream. Children often confuse dreams and reality, and I wanted it to be nothing more than that. Yet when I looked out the window in daylight, I noticed something that had not been there before. The grass near the tree line was flattened, pressed down in a shape that looked almost like footprints, though too long, too wide, too strange to belong to any person I knew. For days afterward, I avoided looking at the woods at night. I kept my curtains drawn. I told myself not to think about it, and yet the memory of that pale figure hung around me like a shadow I could not shake. But children are curious, and fear has a way of mixing with curiosity until one becomes inseparable from the other. 1 week later, I found myself once again pulling the curtain aside late at night, staring into the darkness, searching. The figure was there, this time closer, not at the edge of the woods, but standing directly on our lawn, just beyond the circle where the porch light ended. Its body glowed faintly, casting a thin reflection across the grass, and though it had no face, I felt the unbearable sensation of its gaze fixed upon my window. It did not move, did not drift, did not bend. It stood perfectly still, like a statue placed deliberately in the night. I could not look away. Every instinct told me to hide, but I was held in place by its silent attention. Minutes stretched like hours until, finally, the figure turned and drifted back toward the woods, vanishing into the black line of trees as if it had been swallowed whole. I did not sleep that night. My eyes stayed open, wide and unblinking, until dawn finally brought the comfort of light. The following day, I felt strange, half exhausted, half electrified, like something inside me had changed. And that was only the beginning. Over the next weeks, the figure returned again and again. Sometimes it appeared deep in the woods, moving between the trees with unnatural grace. Sometimes it appeared in the yard, closer and closer each time. Once, it stood so near the house that I could see the glow shimmer faintly on the glass of my window. Its presence was silent but overwhelming, and though it never made a sound, I felt a heavy pressure in my chest whenever it came, as though it was reaching for something inside me without touching. I never told my parents. Something inside me knew they would not believe, or worse, that speaking it aloud would make it more real, would give it more power. Instead, I carried the weight alone, night after night, pretending to sleep while my eyes stayed fixed on the darkness outside. The final night came in late October. The leaves had nearly all fallen. The air was sharp with cold, and Halloween decorations lined the street. I went to bed early, determined not to look, determined to keep the curtain closed. But the pressure came again, stronger than ever, the heavy, undeniable feeling of being watched. Against all my promises to myself, I pulled the curtain back. The figure was standing just beyond the glass, closer than it had ever been. So close that if the window had not been there, I could have reached out and touched its glowing form. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. Though it had no eyes, I felt something dig into me, a strange and terrifying connection that I could not break. My body shook with fear, every muscle screaming to run, but I was frozen. Time dissolved. There was no sound, no movement, only the unbearable closeness of that faceless figure made of light. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. Not by drifting away, not by fading into the woods. It was simply gone, as if it had never been there. The yard was empty. The night was silent. I was left trembling in the dark, too afraid to move, too shaken to cry. The next morning, I found something strange in the yard. Directly below my window, pressed into the soil, was a shape burned into the ground. A circle, faint but clear, as though the grass had been singed away in the outline of something I did not understand. I never saw the figure again after that night. Eventually, I grew older, moved away, and built a life far from those childhood woods. But the memory has never faded. Even now, decades later, when I stand near a forest at night, I feel the same tightness in my chest, the same pressure of unseen eyes. I have never been able to explain what I saw, whether it was a ghost, a vision, or something far stranger. All I know is that the woods behind my childhood home were never empty, and the figure that watched me was real in a way that left a mark far deeper than footprints. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the trees sway outside my window, I still half expect to see that pale glow waiting, patient as ever, at the edge of the dark. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood in the outskirts of a small town in Pennsylvania, where the houses stood far apart, and behind every backyard stretched a wall of thick forest that seemed endless to a child's eyes. My parents had bought the house when I was only 8 years old, and I remember how excited I was when we first moved in, because the place was so different from the small, crowded apartment where we had lived before. The new house felt bigger than anything I had ever seen. It had 2 floors, a wide living room, a small porch out front, and most importantly, my very own bedroom upstairs that looked out over the backyard and the tree line beyond. I was a child who loved exploring. The woods behind our house fascinated me because they seemed alive with mystery. The tall trees swayed in the wind like they were whispering secrets, and at night the shadows cast by the branches would creep across my window, making shapes that my young mind often struggled to explain. My parents were not the kind of people who told ghost stories, but the silence of the forest and the strange noises that sometimes came from it always made me imagine that something lived out there, something that watched us from the darkness. It was during the first autumn in that house when something happened that I still remember with painful clarity, even though many years have passed since then. I was around 9 years old at the time, and I had gotten used to sleeping in my new room upstairs. The nights grew colder, and the leaves outside changed to deep orange and red, covering the ground in layers that rustled whenever the wind passed through. My parents' bedroom was down the hall, but as a child I felt proud that I was learning to stay in my own room without fear. At least, that's what I thought before that night changed everything. It began in a very simple way. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, while the wind outside moved the branches of the trees, making faint scratching sounds against the glass of my window. I remember pulling the blanket up to my chin, telling myself it was only the wind, only the trees moving as they always did. But then something caught my eye. Out of the corner of my vision, past the edge of the curtain, I noticed what looked like a figure standing outside in the yard, facing the house. At first, I thought it must be my imagination, or maybe one of the trees casting an unusual shadow under the pale moonlight. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, hoping that if I blinked enough times the shape would disappear. But when I turned my head and looked directly at the window, my stomach dropped because I could see it clearly now. There was a tall, dark figure, motionless, standing right near the line where the yard ended and the forest began. It wasn't moving, but I felt, deep inside, that it was staring straight at me. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was my father outside checking something. But my father never went out that late at night, and this figure was wrong somehow. Its shape was not quite human, at least not in a way that felt natural. It was tall, far taller than my dad, and too thin, its outline sharp against the lighter background of the trees. I pulled the blanket tighter and told myself not to move, hoping it would fade back into the shadows. Minutes passed, and I could not take my eyes off the window. Then, something happened that made the fear in me grow stronger. The figure stepped forward. It was slow, deliberate, almost as if it wanted me to see it. It came out of the tree line and into the open yard, where the moonlight touched it more fully. My heart pounded so hard that I felt it in my ears, because now there was no mistaking it. It was not a shadow. It was not a trick of my imagination. Something or someone was walking toward my house. I froze in my bed, unable to scream, unable to run, as the figure moved closer until it stopped only a few feet away from my window. Then it lifted its head, and I could see that it had no face, only a smooth, pale surface where features should have been. The sight of that empty, blank face made my whole body go cold. It stood there, facing me directly, and I felt like it was looking into me even though it had no eyes. I wanted to run to my parents' room, but I couldn't make myself move. I just stayed there, gripping the blanket, shaking, my breath shallow, watching as it raised one long, bony arm and rested its hand gently against the glass of my window. I could almost hear the faint vibration as it pressed against the glass, as if testing how thin the barrier between us really was. The minutes that followed felt endless. I sat there with wide eyes, waiting for the glass to shatter, waiting for the figure to climb inside. But it only stood there, silent, unmoving, its hand against the window. My young mind could not understand why it didn't come inside, but at the same time I was grateful it stayed outside. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken me, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the morning to the sound of birds outside. The sunlight was streaming through the window, and the yard looked peaceful again. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream, but when I got out of bed and walked hesitantly to the window, I noticed something that proved it had been real. On the glass, right at the height where the figure's hand had rested, there was a faint smudge, like a handprint pressed into the surface. I never told my parents about that night, because even as a child I knew they would not believe me. But from then on, I never slept with the curtains open again. And even now, as an adult, whenever I see a window at night that faces the dark outside, I cannot help but imagine something standing there, waiting, with its faceless head tilted toward me, just as it did when I was 9 years old in that house by the forest. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and younger sister in an old two-story house in rural Ohio. The house had been built many decades earlier, and it had a certain heaviness to it, kind of weight that old wood and old memories carry. My parents loved the house because it had a big yard and wide rooms, but as a child I felt uneasy in it from the very beginning. The floorboards creaked when no one was walking. The door sometimes moved slightly even when the windows were closed, and at night the hallways seemed darker than any darkness I had ever known before. My bedroom was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. It was not a large room, but it had a window that looked out toward the front yard and a closet built into the wall across from my bed. The closet had a door with an old brass handle, and when I first moved into the room, I remember feeling proud that I had so much space for my clothes and toys. But that pride did not last long, because the closet quickly became the part of the room that made me most uncomfortable. During the day, it looked harmless, just an ordinary space filled with my belongings. But at night, after my parents had turned off the lights and told me goodnight, the closet seemed different. I always had the strange feeling that it was not empty, even when I knew I had checked it earlier. I would lie in bed staring at the dark line where the door met the floor, waiting for something I could not name. The first time something truly unsettling happened, I was about 8 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night, the house silent except for the occasional groan of the old wood shifting. I sat up, trying to calm myself, when I noticed the closet door was slightly open. Only an inch, maybe less, but it was open. I knew I had closed it before going to bed, because I always did. My chest tightened as I stared at the thin line of blackness inside. I wanted to get up and close it, but I was too afraid to step onto the floor. The next morning, when the daylight made everything safe again, I checked the closet. Nothing seemed out of place. My clothes hung neatly, my toys set where I had left them, and there was nothing unusual inside. I told myself maybe the latch was weak and the door had swung open on its own. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Over the weeks that followed, the same thing happened again and again. I would wake in the night to see the closet door cracked open, always just a little more than I remembered leaving it. Sometimes I thought I could see movement in the darkness behind the gap, like the faint shifting of a shadow that had no reason to move. Then things grew worse. One night, as I lay in bed frozen with fear, I heard the sound of breathing coming from inside the closet. It was slow, heavy, steady, the sound of someone standing very still, but unable to hide the rhythm of their breath. I held my own breath, my eyes locked on the door, certain that if it opened wider, I would see something that I could never forget. The sound continued for what felt like hours, until finally I forced myself to hide under the blanket, my small body shaking until I somehow drifted back into sleep. In the daylight, I always convinced myself it was my imagination. Children scare themselves easily, I told myself, and maybe I had dreamed it. But the fear returned every night, stronger than before. Soon I developed habits to protect myself. I stacked toys against the closet door, as if that would keep it shut. I lined up shoes on the floor, like guards standing watch. None of it worked. The door still opened during the night, and sometimes I thought I could hear the faint scrape of something dragging across the floor inside. One night, when I was about 9, I woke to find the door not slightly open, but wide open, as if someone had pulled it fully back. The dark inside was so deep that I could not see the back wall. My body went cold as I stared, because in that darkness, I thought I could see a shape crouching low, just at the edge of the shadows, as if waiting for me to make a sound. I buried myself under the blanket and did not move, barely daring to breathe, until the morning light finally filled the room. When I looked again, the door was closed. My toys were back in place. Everything looked as if nothing had happened, but I knew it had. I could still feel the weight of that unseen presence, the knowledge that something had crouched there, watching me, waiting for me. This continued until the day we moved out of that house. My parents never knew the full truth of why I begged them to let me sleep in my sister's room so often. I told them I was scared of the dark, or that I just wanted company. But the truth was that the closet had become unbearable to face. Even now, as an adult, I cannot sleep in a room with an open closet door. I always make sure it is shut, and sometimes, late at night, I find myself waking suddenly just to check. The memory of that heavy breathing, that shifting shadow, and that wide-open darkness has never left me. And I know, deep in my heart, that the closet in that old house was never truly empty.